Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 89 of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, a few episodes back, I mentioned the idea of interesting visual friends, and boy, has this medium of the internet brought me closer to a lot more interesting visual friends than I would have ever imagined, and certainly than I ever have had before. And one of them is a great guy who I've never met live, but only met virtually, named Dirk Rossler. And Dirk runs an excellent blog website called JapanExposures.com, where he tells us about Japanese photographers, and I actually will profile Japanese photographers from his site a little bit down the road. But he also offers up some really interesting Japanese or Japan-only photo products. So go ahead and check out Dirk's JapanExposures.com site. But in any case, Dirk wrote me a note recently, and he said, "Hi, Jeff, I found this excerpt in Photography, A Cultural History by Mary Warner Marion." Photography, A Cultural History is a general photo history text, a pretty good one, actually. Anyway, he goes on to say, "I'm wondering whether this would make a good subject for camera position. There's not much out there on subject distance, I think. When we think of camera position, we usually jump on where to put the camera, focal length, viewing angle, and framing, but not how far to put the camera from the subject. I think this would make an interesting topic. Regards, Dirk." And he's included a little snippet from this book, Photography, A Cultural History by Mary Warner Marion. And let me just give you a little bit about this. In the little snippet, Marion, the author, is talking about August Sander, the early mid-20th century photographer from Germany. "Sander did not live to see the enormous influence his work and ideas would have on late 20th century photography. His detachment from the subject, coupled with his urge to create comprehensive series, fed the imaginations of Bernd and Hilla Becher in their ongoing sequences of antiquated technological structures. Through the Bechers, many prominent German photographers, such as Andreas Gursky, adopted photographic objectivity as a visual stance in relation to the built environment. Sander's work has been a touchstone of past and present international conceptual artists who have investigated the qualities peculiar to photography, such as how far a subject is placed from the camera. Indeed, his images have nourished the notion that physical distance is an effective visual metaphor for psychic remove." Now let's see if we can deconstruct what Mary Warner Marion says here about these things. You know, of course, we've been talking about camera position for 80-some episodes, but we haven't really, I guess, specifically talked about camera distance. So let's see if we can kind of talk a little bit about what Marion is saying here in this piece, or this little snippet from her book. First of all, August Sander, the great 20th century photographer whose objective was to create a body of work that described the German type, and he categorized his subjects by occupation, class, or other social affiliation. And his objective was to get these really simple compositions that hint at a world alive with every sort of person. His intentions were kind of anthropological. He really was intending to kind of create a catalog in some way of what it is that the German person of the early 20th century looked like. But his images managed to capture a uniqueness of each subject, and that paradox of sort of his objective of being objective and the reality of him ending up being sort of subjective is that paradox really is one of the things that kept him kind of relevant. And as Marion says in her book, one of the things that happened was that Sander wound up being an influence for an awful lot of photographers. A pair of them were Bernd and Hilla Becher, a German duo, husband and wife actually, who created a body of work, a huge body of work, that made images of industrial kinds of objects, industrial things like water towers and blast furnaces and a number of other kinds of objects. And what they did is, where Sander was kind of categorizing his subjects by type or by social affiliation or by occupation, the Bechers developed typologies according to function, displaying photographs that they made in grids And those grids then emphasized the formal similarities of each of the objects that they had photographed. So photographing a dozen or 30 or 100 water towers, the Bechers ended up showing us that while water towers were all water towers, they had this sort of general type, but they also had individual characteristics. And Sander was a big influence on their work, and there was this sort of new objectivity, what it was called a new objectivity, and photographers beginning to look at objects in a different way and thinking about objects and thinking about the way we relate to objects in a different way. And this sort of dispassionate, almost kind of mugshot uniformity that the Bechers had was kind of minimalist, but it also really kind of looked at things in an unsentimental way, kind of just presenting objects. Marion then extends in a sort of logical way to more contemporary photographers like Andreas Gursky. And Gursky, intriguingly, received training and influence from his teachers, Hella and Bernd Becher. And that dispassionate method of very systematically recording and cataloging these industrial machines and architectural objects. And Gursky ends up making these incredibly large-scale images, which are in fact also dispassionate in their approach, partly because of the distance that they maintain from the subject. Now, if we look back at all of these pictures that I've just sort of presented here in the enhanced version of Camera Position, and I'll include a few of these on the cameraposition.com blog page, one of the things we can see is a consistent aspect is that while the camera is not a particularly exact distance from every subject, there is something about the way the camera is distanced from each subject in a way that kind of neutralizes the subject in some way. Sander displays his subjects in this sort of dispassionate way by placing them in an environment and having them stare directly at the camera and having us then kind of fill in the gap in between the camera and the subject. And the Bechers and Gursky kind of put us in this neutral zone, this zone that is neither close nor far from the subject. And in doing that, they create this sort of neutrality of how we perceive the subject. And what's really interesting is if we go on and look at some other photographers, a couple of other photographers who have kind of subverted this idea and put us in the space. So let's take a look at Tina Barney. Tina Barney, a great contemporary photographer who's been photographing for quite a long time, whose pictures of people in their environment give us this sense of how we are in that environment. She actually places us in the environment, partly by placing the camera in a position that not only puts the subject at a certain distance from us, but places us inside the photographic space by showing us objects that are nearby, objects that are far away, and therefore we are in that space. And that's a huge difference between this sort of neutrality or objectivity that Becher and Sander and Gursky are performing, and something like Tina Barney is doing. Or like Jessica Todd Harper, a more contemporary photographer who also is placing us in a space. And that whole idea of how we see inside that space based on where we are inside that space. So the position of the camera isn't just kind of lining up subjects and thinking about interrelationships of subjects, but it also kind of goes a little bit farther than that. It goes on to aspects of how we see, how we are placed within a space, how the space relates to the way we see that space, and how we are asked to interact with the subjects of the photographs. And we can really see in the pictures that we've looked at just now that once one establishes a sort of neutral distance, there is this objectivity, this sort of sense that we are in a no man's land, simply an observer of an outside observer of a situation, whereas the Tina Barneys of the world are placing us inside the space and asking us to become a part of the experience, a part of the place where we are. a part of how we see one another, and a part of how we see the subject. So camera distance, thinking about the way we are proximitous to the subject or not proximitous to the subject. I suppose in some ways it may have to do with focal length. If we pick a particular focal length, that gives us a sort of a sense of how we are in the scene. But more than that, it seems to be, as Mary Warner Marion says in her book, she says, indeed, these images have nourished the notion that the physical distance is an effective visual metaphor for psychic remove. So if we place ourselves in that neutral zone, we are psychically removing ourselves, and therefore the viewer of the image, from the subject. So it's an interesting idea, and I'm really glad that Dirk suggested it as a concept. It got me looking at some photographers in a different way than I had looked at before, and I appreciate that. So thanks, Dirk, and hopefully you'll be able to look at some photographs, not only the ones that other photographers have made, but also some of the ones that you have made. Take a look at how you are placing yourself, not just your camera, but yourself. Are you objective? Are you subjective? How are you placing us, the viewer, into the picture space to give us a sense of your stance relative to the subject? So thanks for joining me on this episode of Camera Position. I very much appreciate those of you who have stopped by the iTunes store and left comments. Thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography. Camera Position is a proud member of the Photocast Network, your photo resource in the potosphere. photocastnetwork.com